I'm Colonel Charlotte Rios, 38 years old, and I worked my way from a small-town ROTC graduate to leading operations that most people will never know existed. For years, I tried to earn the respect of my uncle, a retired Army Master Sergeant who believed women didn't belong anywhere near combat. I gave him loyalty, patience, and every reason to be proud. But when he told a crowd that women like me shouldn't serve, and his Navy SEAL friend turned pale at hearing I was from Unit 47, the Ghost Unit, everything changed. Have you ever been dismissed or belittled by someone you spent your life trying to impress? If so, you're not alone. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground after someone tried to erase your worth, hit that like button and subscribe for more true stories about standing tall when respect isn't freely given. What came after might surprise you. I grew up in a house where the military wasn't just respected, it was gospel. My Uncle Frank had served 23 years in the Army, retiring as a Master Sergeant, and in our small Texas town, that made him something close to royalty. Every 4th of July barbecue, every Thanksgiving dinner, every family gathering revolved around his stories. He'd sit in his chair on the back porch, beer in hand, and hold court about discipline, sacrifice, and what it meant to serve your country. I listened to every word. When I was 7, he let me try on his old uniform jacket. The sleeves hung past my hands, the shoulders drooped nearly to my elbows, but I stood straighter than I ever had. "Looks good on you, Charlie," he said, and I felt 10 feet tall. Then he added, with that half-smile he always wore when he was about to say something he thought was funny, "Course, by the time you're old enough, they'll probably have you doing the paperwork while the men do the real work." Everyone laughed. I laughed too, even though something in my chest tightened. I was 22 when I commissioned into the Air Force as a second lieutenant. I'd graduated top of my ROTC class, passed every physical test with room to spare, and chosen a career path in operations coordination. My parents threw a small party. Frank showed up late, stayed for an hour, and spent most of it explaining to his buddies how the Air Force was necessary, but not quite the same as ground combat. He clapped me on the shoulder before he left. "Proud of you, kid. Just remember, some jobs are desk jobs for a reason." I told myself he meant well, that his pride was just buried under layers of old-school thinking. So I kept my head down and worked. I worked harder than I needed to, longer than I should have, because some part of me still wanted him to see me the way I'd seen him when I was 7 years old. By the time I made captain at 28, I was coordinating missions across multiple time zones, managing logistics that kept people alive in places I couldn't talk about. I came home for Christmas that year, and Frank asked what I'd been up to. I gave him the sanitized version, strategic planning, operational support. He nodded slowly. "Sounds like a lot of emails." One of his friends laughed into his drink. I excused myself early and didn't come back the next day. The evolution was gradual. It wasn't one moment or one comment, it was the accumulation of 1,000 small dismissals. During my early 20s, he'd praised my PT scores, but reminded me that real soldiering was something different. By my late 20s, the praise stopped altogether. I became a case study in his arguments about military standards, a data point in debates I never asked to be part of. At a cousin's wedding, I overheard him tell someone, "She's sharp, I'll give her that." But they're lowering the bar to make the numbers look good. It's politics. I started visiting less. When I did come home, I kept conversations surface level. "How's the weather? How's your back? Seen any good games lately?" I stopped mentioning deployments or promotions. It was easier that way. Easier than watching him diminish everything I did before I'd even finished saying it. The irony was that I loved the work. I loved the precision of it, the weight of decisions that mattered, the people I served alongside who didn't care about my gender. They cared whether I could do the job. And I could. I was good at it. Better than good. I made major at 33, ahead of schedule, and started leading tactical planning teams for cross-branch operations. The work was classified, intense, and exactly what I'd trained for. Frank found out about the promotion through my mother. He called me 2 days later. "Major, huh? That's something." There was a pause. "Just don't forget where you came from." I didn't know what that meant, and I didn't ask. When I was 34, I was selected for a joint task force assignment. The details were need to know, the vetting process was exhaustive, and the work was unlike anything I'd done before. I couldn't tell my family where I was going or when I'd be back. My mother cried when I said goodbye. Frank shook my hand and said, "Stay safe. And stay out of the way of the people doing the actual fighting." I spent the next 18 months in places that don't exist on any map you can Google. I worked with people from every branch: Army Rangers, Navy SEALs, Marine Recon, Air Force Special Tactics. We didn't talk about rank unless we had to. We talked about mission objectives, threat assessments, extraction windows. I learned things about myself I hadn't known were there: how much fear I could carry and still function, how much exhaustion I could push through, how much loss I could witness and still get up the next morning. There were 12 of us when it started. We called ourselves Unit 47, though that wasn't the official designation. It was just a number on a roster somewhere, a line item in a budget that didn't acknowledge what we actually did. By the time I came home, there were 4 of us left. The rest were listed as casualties in training accidents, vehicle malfunctions, things that sounded plausible enough that no one asked questions. I didn't talk about it. Not because I was trying to be mysterious, but because I didn't have the words. How do you explain months of living on adrenaline and MREs, of making decisions where every option costs something, of watching people you respect die for objectives you can't defend at a dinner table? You don't. You smile, you say it went fine, and you move on. Frank didn't ask many questions when I got back. I'd been promoted to lieutenant colonel while I was gone, a battlefield promotion that came with a handshake and a brief ceremony in a tent that smelled like diesel and dust. He heard about it third hand and sent a text, "Congrats. Don't let it go to your head." I stopped trying to make him understand. I stopped trying to make him proud. I focused on the work, on the people I led, on doing the job well enough that the losses meant something. It wasn't about him anymore. Maybe it never should have been. But I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt. The breaking point came on a Saturday in July. Frank was turning 60, and my mother insisted on throwing him a barbecue. Half the neighborhood showed up, along with a rotating cast of his old army buddies, men in their 50s and 60s who wore faded unit shirts and talked about the world like it had stopped changing the day they retired. I'd driven 6 hours to be there, and I was regretting it before I even got out of the car. My mother hugged me at the door. "He's in a good mood," she said, which I knew meant he'd been drinking since noon. "Try to be patient with him." I smiled and told her I would. The backyard was full of lawn chairs and coolers, the grill smoking with burgers and hot dogs. Frank held court near the picnic table, surrounded by his usual audience. I made the rounds, shaking hands and making small talk, deflecting questions about where I'd been stationed with the same vague answers I always gave. Most people didn't push. They could tell from my tone that it wasn't a conversation I wanted to have. I was halfway through a plate of potato salad when Frank's voice carried across the yard. "Charlie, get over here. Want you to meet someone." I set my plate down and walked over. Frank had his arm around a man I didn't recognize, late 50s, gray hair cropped military short, the kind of build that suggested he still hit the gym regularly. Frank was grinning, that loose, easy grin he got after a few beers. "This is Rick Hayes. Served with the SEALs for 26 years. Senior Chief, retired." "Rick, this is my niece, Charlotte." Rick extended a hand. His grip was firm but not aggressive. "Pleasure," he said. His eyes were sharp, assessing me in the way people who've spent their lives in dangerous places assess everyone. "Likewise," I said. Frank gestured at me with his beer bottle. "Charlie's Air Force. Officer. Makes the big decisions from behind a desk." He said it like a punchline, and a few of the guys chuckled. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my expression neutral. "Strategic operations," I said evenly. "Someone has to coordinate what happens on the ground." Frank snorted. "See, that's the thing. Women like you shouldn't serve. I'm not saying you're not smart, you're smart as hell. But combat's not your world. It's not built for you. And pretending it is just puts everyone at risk." The conversation around us had gone quiet. I could feel eyes on me, waiting to see how I'd react. My mother was watching from the porch, her hand pressed to her mouth. I took a slow breath. I've served long enough to know what my world is. Frank shook his head, still smiling, like I'd just proven his point. You've been in the Air Force for what, 15 years? That's great. But there's a difference between serving and being in the fight. You've done logistics, planning, coordination, important stuff, don't get me wrong. But it's not the same as being downrange, boots on the ground, taking fire. That's men's work. Always has been. Rick shifted his weight slightly, his gaze flicking between me and Frank. He hadn't said anything yet, but I could see the gears turning. I looked at Frank, at the man I'd spent my childhood idolizing, and felt something inside me settle into a cold, quiet certainty. I wasn't angry. I was tired. Tired of justifying myself, tired of defending my service to someone who'd decided long ago that it didn't count. You're right, I said. There is a difference. Frank raised his bottle like I'd conceded. Exactly. I knew I've been in the fight, I said. I've been downrange. I've taken fire. I've made calls that cost lives and saved lives, sometimes in the same breath. And I did it all while people like you sat at home deciding I didn't belong there. The yard was silent now. Frank's smile had frozen on his face, uncertain, like he couldn't tell if I was joking. Rick spoke for the first time since the handshake. His voice was calm, almost casual. What unit did you serve with? I turned to him. Unit 47. His beer slipped from his hand. It hit the grass with a dull thud, foam spilling out across the dirt. He stared at me like I'd just told him I was a ghost. The ghost unit? His voice was barely above a whisper. I thought none survived. Frank looked between us, confusion replacing the easy confidence he'd worn a moment ago. What the hell is Unit 47? Rick didn't take his eyes off me. It was a joint task force. Multi-branch. Deep operations in denied territory. The kind of missions that don't make the news because officially, they never happened. He swallowed hard. I knew a guy who briefed them once. He said they were the best trained team he'd ever seen. He also said the survival rate was under 30%. Frank's face had gone pale. Charlie, 4 of us made it back, I said quietly. Out of 12. Rick was still staring. Jesus Christ. He looked at Frank, then back at me. How long were you with them? 18 months. And you're still. He stopped himself, shook his head. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to, he straightened, and before I realized what he was doing, he'd come to attention and rendered a crisp salute. I hadn't been saluted in a civilian setting in years. It caught me off guard, enough that it took me a second to return it. When I dropped my hand, Rick was looking at me differently. Not assessing anymore. Something closer to respect. It's an honor, he said simply. Frank's mouth was open. He looked at me like he didn't know who I was. I picked up my plate. I'm going to finish my lunch. I walked back to the porch. My mother was crying quietly, her hand still pressed to her mouth. I sat down next to her, and she put her arm around me without saying a word. Behind us, I could hear Frank trying to ask Rick questions, his voice too loud, too insistent. Rick's answers were short, clipped. I didn't turn around. I didn't need to. For the first time in 15 years, I didn't care what Frank thought. I'd spent long enough trying to prove myself to someone who'd already made up his mind. Frank didn't call for 3 weeks. When he finally did, it was late on a Tuesday night. I'd just gotten back from a 14-hour shift coordinating a training exercise and was halfway through reheating leftovers when my phone buzzed. I saw his name on the screen and considered not answering. But I did. Yeah, it's me. His voice was flat, missing the usual bluster. Got a minute? Sure. There was a long pause, the kind that stretches out because neither person knows how to fill it. I pulled a chair out from the kitchen table and sat down, waiting. Your mother says you're mad at me. I closed my eyes. I'm not mad, Frank. Then what are you? Tired. Another pause. Rick called me yesterday. Told me some things. About Unit 47. What they did, where they went. He wouldn't give me details, but he said enough. I didn't respond. If you were really there, Frank said slowly, you wouldn't be talking about it. Something in my chest went very still. Excuse me. I'm just saying, people who do that kind of work, they don't go around announcing it at barbecues. They stay quiet. So either you weren't really there or you're breaking protocol. Either way, it doesn't add up. I set the phone down on the table and stared at it for a long moment. Then I picked it back up. I spent 18 months watching people die. I came home and didn't say a word about it to anyone, not my friends, not my colleagues, not even Mom, because I knew no one would understand. But you stood in your backyard and told a dozen people that women like me shouldn't serve, that we're a liability, that we don't belong. So yeah, I said something. Because I was done letting you erase me. Charlie, I'm not finished. You want to question whether I was there? Fine. You want to tell yourself I'm lying because it's easier than admitting you were wrong? Go ahead. But don't call me and pretend this is about protocol. This is about you not being able to handle the fact that your niece did something you didn't think she could. I hung up. My hand was shaking. He didn't call back. The rumors started small. My cousin heard it from her husband, who heard it from someone at Frank's VFW post. My aunt mentioned it in passing during a phone call with my mother, something about how people were asking questions, how Frank had been embarrassed at his own party. By the time I came home for Christmas, the whole family had some version of the story, and none of them matched. Some people thought I was exaggerating. Others thought I'd done something classified and shouldn't have mentioned it at all. A few believed me outright and wanted details I couldn't give. My younger brother asked if I'd actually killed anyone, and I walked out of the room without answering. Frank didn't come to Christmas dinner. My mother said he wasn't feeling well, but I knew better. In January, I got a call from Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Beck. We'd served together briefly during my time with Unit 47. He'd been the mission coordinator, the one who kept everyone alive long enough to complete the objective. He'd since moved into a training role at Hurlburt Field, and we stayed in touch when we could. Heard you caused a stir, he said. I laughed, short and humorless. That's one way to put it. Want to talk about it? I told him the whole story, the barbecue, the confrontation, the fallout. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I'd always appreciated about Aaron. He didn't try to fix things. He just listened. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know what the hardest part of that kind of service is?" "What?" "Coming home and realizing no one knows what to do with you. They want you to be the person you were before, but that person doesn't exist anymore. And the person you are now doesn't fit into their idea of who you should be." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling. So, what do? You stop trying to make them understand. You find the people who already do, and you build your life around them. The rest, he paused. The rest is just noise. Even if it's family? Especially if it's family. Because they're the ones who have the hardest time letting go of who they think you are. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up. Aaron was right. I'd spent years trying to earn Frank's respect, trying to prove that I belonged in a world he didn't think I fit into. But Frank wasn't the arbiter of my worth. He never had been. I'd just given him that power because I didn't know how to take it back. In March, I was offered a position as the operations officer for a classified detachment out of Nellis. It was a significant step up, more responsibility, more autonomy, more influence over how missions were planned and executed. I accepted without hesitation. When I told my mother, she cried. Happy tears, she said, though I wasn't sure I believed her. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. I just wish I know." He does too. He just doesn't know how to say it. I didn't argue with her. But I also didn't believe her. Frank had made his position clear. And I'd made mine. I moved to Nevada in April. The work was exactly what I needed, demanding, complex, the kind of thing that required every bit of focus I had. I mentored junior officers, rebuilt training protocols, and coordinated with teams across the country. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking over my shoulder, waiting for someone to tell me I didn't belong. I was 38 when I was promoted to lieutenant colonel. The ceremony was small, just a handful of colleagues and my immediate commander, Brigadier General Hart. He pinned the new rank on my uniform and shook my hand. "You've earned this," he said. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." I hadn't planned on telling Frank. But my mother must have said something, because 2 days later, he showed up at the ceremony venue, a small conference room on base that was being used for a different event. I was walking out to my car when I saw him standing by the entrance, hands in his pockets, looking older than I remembered. "Didn't think you'd come," I said. "Wasn't invited." "No, you weren't." He flinched, just slightly. "Can we talk?" "Depends." Are you going to tell me I don't deserve this? No. He looked at the ground, then back at me. I came to say congratulations. And to ask, he stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. You think you're better than us now? I stared at him. No, Frank. I just stopped needing permission. He didn't have an answer for that. I got in my car and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I saw him still standing there, alone in the parking lot, and for the first time, I didn't feel guilty. Frank's health started declining that summer. My mother called in August to say he'd been in and out of the hospital, high blood pressure, a minor heart incident, the kind of thing that happens when you're 62 and haven't taken care of yourself the way you should. She asked if I'd come visit. I told her I'd think about it. I didn't go. It wasn't out of spite. I'd simply run out of the energy it took to navigate that relationship. Every conversation with Frank required me to brace myself, to prepare for judgment or dismissal, to decide in advance how much I was willing to tolerate before walking away. I didn't want to do that anymore. So I didn't. But I thought about him. More than I wanted to admit. I thought about the man who'd let me try on his uniform jacket when I was 7, who'd taught me how to stand at attention and how to fold a flag. I thought about the version of him I'd hero worshipped and the version I'd spent the last decade trying to prove myself to. Neither of those men existed anymore. Maybe they never had. In September, Rick Hayes called me. I almost didn't answer. I hadn't spoken to him since the barbecue, and I wasn't sure I wanted to revisit that day. But something made me pick up. Charlotte? It's Rick. Frank's friend. We met at, I remember. Right. Listen, I wanted to reach out because I've been thinking about what happened at the party. And I owe you an apology. I frowned. For what? For not saying something sooner. I've known Frank for 20 years, and I've heard him talk about you 100 times. I knew he had issues with women in combat, but I didn't realize how deep it went until that day. I should have stepped in earlier. Should have told him he was out of line. You saluted me, I said. That was enough. No, it wasn't. You deserved better than that. From all of us. He paused. I've been doing some reading since then. About Unit 47. Took some digging. Most of it's still classified, but I found enough to know what you went through. What you survived. I didn't say anything. I wanted you to know that I told Frank. Not the details, I don't have those, and I wouldn't share them if I did. But I told him what I could. That the unit was real. That the survival rate was under 30%. That the people who made it back were some of the toughest, most capable operators I'd ever heard of. What did he say? Rick was quiet for a moment. Not much. I think it's hard for him to process. He spent his whole life believing a certain thing, and now he's being told it's not true. That's not an easy adjustment, especially for someone like Frank. That's not my problem. No, Rick said. It's not. But I thought you should know he keeps a photo of you on his mantle. You in uniform. It's been there for years. I noticed it the first time I visited his house, but I didn't think much of it until now. I closed my eyes. Why are you telling me this? Because I think he's proud of you. He just doesn't know how to say it. Or maybe he's too stubborn to admit he was wrong. Either way, I thought you deserved to know. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at nothing. I didn't know what to do with that information. Pride shouldn't come with conditions. It shouldn't require years of silence and distance before someone finally acknowledges what you've done. But maybe that was all Frank had to offer. Maybe that was the best he could do. I didn't call him. I wasn't ready for that. But I stopped avoiding my mother's calls when she wanted to talk about him. The work kept me grounded. By October, I was running a detachment of 32 personnel, pilots, analysts, logistics officers, all of them sharp and capable. I mentored where I could, particularly the younger women who reminded me of myself at 25, hungry to prove themselves in a field that didn't always make space for them. One of them was Captain Maya Lopez, 29 years old, newly assigned to our team after completing a rotation in Afghanistan. She was brilliant, quick, precise, unshakable under pressure. She also carried the same tension I'd carried for years, the sense that she had to be twice as good to be considered half as competent. We were reviewing mission plans one afternoon when she asked, out of nowhere, "Do you ever regret it?" I looked up. Regret what? Serving. Staying in. Dealing with all this, she gestured vaguely. The politics. The people who don't think you belong. I leaned back in my chair. Every day. She blinked, surprised. But I also don't, I said. Because the alternative is letting them win. And I'm not interested in that. She nodded slowly. How do you deal with it? The doubt. The constant feeling like you have to prove yourself. You stop trying to prove yourself to people who've already decided you're not enough. You focus on the mission, on the people who matter, on doing the work well. And you remember that the doubt isn't about you, it's about them. Maya smiled, small but genuine. Thank you, ma'am. Don't thank me yet. You've got about 6 more years of this before you make major. She laughed, and I saw a little of the tension leave her shoulders. In November, I got word that Frank had been admitted to the VA hospital. Heart complications, my mother said. They were keeping him for observation. I asked if he was okay, and she said the doctors were optimistic but cautious. I still didn't visit. Rick called again in early December. He's asking for you. He can call me himself if he wants to talk. I don't think he knows how. Pride's a hell of a thing. Yeah, I said. It is. Charlotte, look, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. But he's not doing great. And I think if there's something that needs to be said, now might be the time. I told him I'd think about it. That night, I pulled out an old photo album my mother had given me years ago. There was a picture of me and Frank from when I was 10, both of us in camouflage jackets, standing in front of his truck, grinning at the camera. I looked so small next to him, so sure that he knew everything. I put the album away and went to bed. But I didn't sleep much. I drove to the VA hospital on a Saturday in mid-December. It was a 4-hour trip, and I spent most of it trying to figure out what I was going to say. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, I still didn't have an answer. The hospital was a sprawling complex of beige buildings that all looked the same. I checked in at the front desk, got a visitor's badge, and followed the signs to the cardiology wing. My mother had texted me the room number that morning, along with a message that just said, "Thank you." Frank was in a room at the end of the hall alone. The TV was on, playing some old Western with the sound turned low. He was sitting up in bed, thinner than I remembered, his face pale and drawn. He looked up when I walked in, and for a second, neither of us said anything. "Didn't think you'd come," he said finally. "Yeah, well, I'm full of surprises." He smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Your mother tell you to come? She mentioned you were here." I made my own decision. Fair enough. He gestured to the chair by the bed. "You gonna stand there, or are you gonna sit?" I sat. The chair was stiff and uncomfortable, the kind of institutional furniture designed to discourage long visits. I set my jacket on the armrest and folded my hands in my lap. Frank muted the TV. "How've you been?" "Busy." "You?" "Oh, you know. Living the dream." He glanced down at the 4 in his arm, the monitors beeping softly beside him. "Doctors say I need to change my diet. Cut back on the drinking. All the things I've been ignoring for the past 20 years. Sounds like good advice." "Probably." He looked at me, his expression unreadable. "Rick told me he called you." "He did. What did he say?" "That you've been asking about Unit 47. That you're having a hard time with it." Frank was quiet for a moment. "I'm not having a hard time with it. I'm trying to understand it. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yeah." He shifted in the bed, wincing slightly. "Look, I spent 23 years in the Army. I saw a lot of things, did a lot of things. And I had certain beliefs about how the world worked. About who was built for what. And then you show up at my birthday and tell me you were part of some ghost unit that I didn't even know existed, and Rick, who doesn't impress easy, treats you like you're some kind of legend. That's not easy to process. So process it." "I'm trying." He rubbed his face with one hand. "I talked to some people. Guys I know who've been around. They wouldn't give me details, but they confirmed enough. Said Unit 47 was real. Said it was one of the hardest assignments in the military. Said most people didn't come back. 4 of us did," I said quietly. "Out of 12. He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something other than stubbornness in his eyes. "Jesus, Charlie. I couldn't tell you. I couldn't tell anyone. That was the deal." "I know." Rick explained that part. He hesitated. I also know I didn't make it easy for you. Before that, I mean. I said a lot of things over the years that he stopped, seemed to struggle with the words. That weren't fair. No, I said. They weren't. I thought I was being realistic. I thought I was protecting you from a world that wasn't going to treat you right. But I was wrong. I waited. You did something I couldn't have done, he said. And instead of respecting that, I made it about me. About what I thought the military should be. That was wrong. And I'm sorry. The apology hung in the air between us. I wanted to feel something: relief, vindication, closure. But all I felt was tired. I appreciate that, I said. But an apology doesn't change the last 15 years. It doesn't change the things you said, or the way you made me feel like I had to justify my existence every time I came home. I know. Do you? Because it's easy to apologize now, when you're lying in a hospital bed and you've finally heard from someone you respect that I'm telling the truth. But where were you when I needed you to believe me? Where were you when I was 25 and trying to figure out if I belonged in a career I loved? Where were you when I came back from deployments and couldn't talk about what I'd seen because I knew you'd dismiss it? Frank didn't answer. I spent years trying to earn your respect, I said. And I finally realized I don't need it. I did the work. I survived. I came home. That's enough. It has to be. You're right. His voice was rough. It is enough. And I'm sorry I made you think it wasn't. I looked at him, at the man who'd been larger than life when I was a kid, and saw someone smaller now. Not because he'd shrunk, but because I'd grown past the version of him I'd built in my head. I forgive you, I said. But I'm not going back to the way things were. I can't. That version of me doesn't exist anymore. I wouldn't ask you to. We sat in silence for a while. The TV flickered in the background, the Western playing out its predictable ending. Frank closed his eyes, and for a moment, I thought he'd fallen asleep. But then he spoke again, quieter this time. Rick told me you have a photo. On your mantle. He opened his eyes. Yeah, you in uniform. The day you made captain. Your mother sent it to me. I've had it up ever since. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know how. I was proud of you, Charlie. I just didn't know how to say it without admitting I'd been wrong about everything else. I nodded slowly. Guess I got that wrong war thing from you. He smiled, just a little. Guess you did. I stayed for another hour. We didn't talk about Unit 47 or the years of tension. We talked about small things: his doctors, my new assignment, a fishing trip he wanted to take once he got out of the hospital. It wasn't reconciliation, not really. But it was something. When I left, he shook my hand. Take care of yourself, Colonel. You too, Frank. I walked out of the hospital into the cold December air, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. Frank came home from the hospital 2 weeks before Christmas. My mother called to tell me he was doing better, that the doctors had cleared him with a long list of lifestyle changes he needed to follow. She sounded relieved, and I was glad for her. She'd spent years caught between us, trying to smooth over conflicts that weren't hers to fix. I didn't visit again right away. The conversation at the hospital had been enough for both of us, I think, a starting point, but not a destination. We needed space to figure out what came next, if anything. Instead, I focused on work. The holidays were always a strange time on base, half the personnel trying to get leave, the other half covering for them. I volunteered to take the duty shifts, partly because I didn't have anywhere urgent to be, partly because I liked the quiet that came with skeleton crews and empty offices. On Christmas Eve, I was reviewing training schedules in my office when Captain Maya Lopez knocked on the door. She was supposed to be on leave, visiting family in California. Thought you'd be gone by now, I said. Flight got delayed. Weather. She shrugged. Mind if I come in? Sure. She sat down across from me, glancing at the stack of files on my desk. You always work on Christmas Eve? Only when I'm avoiding family gatherings. She laughed. Fair enough. Then, more seriously, I wanted to thank you. For the mentorship. For the advice. It's made a difference. You're doing the work. I'm just watching. Still. She hesitated. I heard a rumor. About you. Something about a classified unit. I kept my expression neutral. People talk. Yeah, they do. She met my eyes. I'm not asking for details. I just wanted to say, whatever you did, wherever you were, it matters. Not just to the mission, but to people like me. Knowing that someone made it through, that someone proved it was possible, that means something. I didn't know what to say to that. So I just nodded. She stood. Anyway, Merry Christmas, ma'am. Merry Christmas, Maya. After she left, I sat alone in the office for a while, thinking about what she'd said. I'd never thought of my service as something that mattered beyond the immediate mission. But maybe it did. Maybe just by surviving, by refusing to quit, I'd left a trail for the people coming after me. New Year came and went. In January, I got a call from Rick Hayes. He and Frank had gone fishing Frank's first trip out since the hospital, and Rick wanted me to know it had gone well. He's doing better, Rick said. Not perfect, but better. And he talks about you differently now. With respect. That's good. It is. Rick paused. He asked me to give you something. Said he'd mail it himself, but he wasn't sure you'd open it if it came from him. What is it? His old unit patch. From his first deployment. He wanted you to have it. The package arrived a week later, a small padded envelope with Frank's handwriting on the label. Inside was the patch, faded and frayed at the edges, and a note written on lined paper. Charlie, this was the first patch I ever earned. Wore it through 2 deployments and more missions than I can count. I kept it all these years because it reminded me of who I was when I believed in something bigger than myself. I want you to have it. Not because I think you need it, but because I think you've earned it. You've done things I couldn't, survived things I wouldn't have, and you did it without anyone's permission. That's the kind of soldier, the kind of person I should have recognized a long time ago. I'm proud of you. I should have said it sooner. I read the note twice, then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. The patch sat on my desk for a few days before I decided what to do with it. I didn't frame it or display it. I put it in my go bag, the one I carried on deployments, tucked into a side pocket where I'd see it every time I packed. It wasn't forgiveness exactly, but it was acknowledgement. And that was enough. February brought new assignments, new challenges. I was asked to brief a group of senior officers on operational lessons learned from unconventional warfare, careful, sanitized lessons that didn't reveal anything classified, but still conveyed the complexity of the work. It was the first time I'd spoken publicly about that part of my career, even in abstract terms. Afterward, a brigadier general I didn't know approached me. That was a hell of a briefing, Colonel. You've clearly been in the thick of it. Thank you, sir. We need more officers like you. People who've seen it firsthand and can articulate what it means. Have you thought about a teaching role? War college, maybe. I hadn't. But the idea stayed with me. In March, Maya Lopez was selected for a high-level training program, one of the most competitive in the Air Force. She came to my office to tell me, practically glowing. I wouldn't have applied if you hadn't pushed me, she said. You earned it. Still. Thank you. Watching her walk out, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. Not for myself, but for the generation coming up behind me. They'd have their own battles to fight, their own doubts to navigate. But they wouldn't be starting from scratch. They'd have examples, pathways, proof that it could be done. In April, Frank called me for the first time since the hospital. Not my mother passing along a message, not Rick playing intermediary, Frank calling me directly. Hey, he said. Got a minute? Yeah. I'm organizing a thing. Small gathering. Some of the guys from the old unit. Thought maybe you'd want to come. Meet some people. Hear some stories. I was surprised. You want me there? Yeah, I do. He paused. You're part of this world, Charlie. Always have been. I just didn't see it. But I do now. And I think the guys would benefit from hearing your perspective. I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. I went. It was strange at first, walking into a room full of men who'd known Frank for decades, who'd heard his opinions about women in combat, who'd probably agreed with him more often than not. But Rick was there, and he made introductions, and by the end of the night, I'd had half a dozen conversations that felt real. One of the guys, a former ranger, pulled me aside. Frank told us about Unit 47. Not details, but enough. I just wanted to say respect. That kind of work, that kind of survival rate, it's no joke. Thanks. And for what it's worth, you changed his mind. About a lot of things. That's not easy to do. I didn't respond, but I thought about it on the drive home. Changing someone's mind wasn't the goal. Living my truth was. But if Frank had learned something along the way, if he'd grown past the limitations of his own thinking, maybe that mattered too. Spring turned into summer, and the rhythm of work carried me forward. By June, I'd been in my role as operations officer for over a year, and the detachment was running smoothly enough that I could step back and focus on longer-term planning. General Hart called me into his office one afternoon and told me I was being considered for promotion to full colonel. "It's not guaranteed," he said. "But your record speaks for itself. You've earned this." "Thank you, sir." "I'm serious, Rios. You're one of the best officers I've worked with. The kind of leader people trust. Don't lose that." I left his office feeling something I hadn't felt in years, validated. Not by family, not by people trying to fit me into their expectations, but by the institution I'd served. It wasn't perfect, and there were still battles to fight, but I belonged here. I'd proven that. In August, Frank invited me to his house for a barbecue. It was a smaller gathering this time, just family and a handful of close friends. My mother hugged me when I arrived, holding on a little longer than usual. "I'm glad you came," she said. "Me too." Frank was at the grill, looking healthier than he had in months. He waved when he saw me, and I walked over. Hey. He flipped a burger, glanced at me. "You eat yet?" "Not yet." "Good. These'll be ready in 5. We stood there in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Frank said, "Rick's bringing someone. Young guy, just out of BUD/S, wanted him to meet you." "Why?" "Because he's got potential. And I think hearing your story, what you've done, where you've been, might help him figure out his path." I looked at Frank, saw the sincerity in his expression, and felt something shift. This was his way of making amends. Not through grand gestures or endless apologies, but through action. By recognizing my service and using it to help someone else. "Okay," I said. Rick arrived an hour later with the young SEAL, a kid named Torres, maybe 25, eager and a little nervous. Frank introduced us, and Torres shook my hand with the kind of grip that said he was trying to prove something. "Colonel Rios served with Unit 47, Frank said. "She's seen more action than most people twice her age." Torres's eyes widened. "Unit 47? I've heard stories. Didn't think anyone from that unit was still around." "4 of us made it back," I said. He stopped, seemed to struggle for words. "That's incredible, ma'am." We talked for a while. He asked careful questions, and I gave careful answers, sharing what I could without crossing into classified territory. By the end of the conversation, some of the nervousness had left his face, replaced by something steadier. "Thank you," he said before he left. "For your service. And for taking the time. Good luck out there." After he was gone, Frank came over with 2 beers. He handed me one and sat down in the chair next to me. "You did good with him," he said. "He's sharp. He'll figure it out." "Maybe." Frank took a sip of his beer. "You know, I've been thinking a lot lately. About legacy. About what we leave behind." Yeah. I spent 23 years in the Army, and I'm proud of that. But the thing I'm most proud of now? It's you." I looked at him, surprised. "I mean it," he said. "You're doing things I never could. Leading in ways I didn't know how to. And you're doing it without compromising who you are. That's the kind of legacy that matters." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. We sat there as the sun went down, the yard full of quiet conversation and the smell of charcoal. It wasn't perfect. There were still scars, still unspoken things that might never be fully resolved. But it was enough. In September, the promotion board results came through. I was selected for colonel, with a pin-on ceremony scheduled for November. My mother cried when I told her. Frank sent a text that just said, "Congratulations. You earned it." The ceremony was held in a hangar at Nellis, attended by about 50 people, colleagues, subordinates, a few friends I'd made over the years. General Hart officiated, and when he pinned the eagle insignia on my uniform, he said, "This is long overdue, Colonel Rios. Congratulations." Frank was there. He sat in the back, next to my mother, and when I caught his eye afterward, he gave me a small nod. It wasn't effusive. It wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Maya Lopez found me after the ceremony. Congratulations, ma'am. This is huge. Thanks. And it's Colonel now, not ma'am. She grinned. Yes, Colonel. How's the training program going? Brutal, but worth it. She hesitated. Can I ask you something? Sure. Do you ever feel like you have to be perfect? Like one mistake, and it'll confirm everything people already think about women in the military. I looked at her, saw the weight she was carrying, and remembered what it felt like to shoulder that burden every single day. Yeah, I said. I do. But here's the thing, you're going to make mistakes. Everyone does. And some people will use those mistakes to justify their biases. But the work you're doing, the example you're setting, that matters more. Don't let the fear of being imperfect stop you from being excellent. She nodded slowly. Thank you, Colonel. I watched her walk away, and I thought about all the women who'd come before me, who'd fought their own battles and paved their own paths. And I thought about the ones who'd come after, who'd faced their own challenges and doubts. We were all part of something bigger, a slow, steady shift toward a military that made space for everyone willing to serve. That night, I went home to my small house on the edge of base and sat on the back porch with a drink. The air was cool, the sky clear. I thought about the girl who'd worn her uncle's jacket and dreamed of being a soldier. I thought about the woman who'd survived 18 months in Unit 47 and came home a ghost. I thought about the officer I was now scarred, sure, but still standing. Respect isn't given. It's proven. Sometimes after the noise stops, sometimes long after you've stopped caring whether you have it. But it comes. Eventually, it comes. The years that followed were quieter. Not easy, work at this level was never easy, but steadier. I settled into my role as colonel, commanding a detachment that grew from 32 personnel to over 60. The missions were varied, the challenges constant, but I'd learned how to navigate them without losing myself in the process. Frank's health stabilized. He followed his doctor's orders more than he ignored them, which my mother said was a minor miracle. We talked on the phone every few weeks, conversations that were shorter than they probably should have been but felt genuine. He asked about my work, and I asked about his fishing trips, and neither of us tried to force more than that. In the spring of my second year as colonel, I was invited to speak at the Air Force Academy's Leadership Symposium. The topic was resilience in unconventional operations, broad enough to avoid classified details, specific enough to be useful. I accepted, though public speaking had never been my strength. The auditorium was packed with cadets, young men and women who looked impossibly young to me, though I knew I'd been their age once. I stood at the podium, looked out at the sea of faces, and took a breath. Resilience isn't about being unbreakable, I started. It's about breaking and putting yourself back together enough times that you learn how the pieces fit. I've led missions that succeeded and missions that failed. I've lost people I cared about and made decisions I'll carry for the rest of my life. And I'm standing here not because I did everything right, but because I refused to quit when things went wrong. I talked for 30 minutes, sharing what I could about leadership under pressure, about trusting your team, about the difference between confidence and arrogance. When I finished, the applause was polite but not overwhelming. I didn't expect it to be. These were kids still figuring out what kind of officers they wanted to become. My words would either mean something to them later or they wouldn't. Afterward, a cadet approached me, a young woman, maybe 20, with sharp eyes and a nervous energy that reminded me of Maya Lopez. Colonel Rios? I'm Cadet Ramirez. I just wanted to say thank you. She paused, searching for words. That was the first time I've heard someone talk about failure like it's part of the process instead of something to hide. Failure is part of the process, I said. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying or hasn't been tested yet. She smiled. Can I ask you something? How do you handle the doubt? The feeling like you don't belong. You remind yourself why you're here. And you surround yourself with people who see your value even when you can't. Thank you, ma'am. That helps. I watched her walk away and thought about how many versions of her I'd met over the years, young women trying to prove themselves, trying to find their place in an institution that hadn't always made room for them. I didn't have all the answers, but I could offer what I'd learned, and that felt like enough. In June, I received word that Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Beck was retiring. He called me a few days later to let me know personally. 26 years, he said. Feels like the right time. What are you going to do? Take my wife on that trip to Italy she's been asking about for a decade. Maybe write a book. Definitely sleep past 0600 hours. I laughed. You've earned it. So have you. Don't wait as long as I did to realize it. His retirement ceremony was held at Hurlburt Field. I flew out for it, along with a handful of others who'd served with him over the years. During his speech, Aaron talked about the people who'd shaped his career, the missions that mattered, the lessons he'd carry forward. He mentioned Unit 47 briefly, carefully, acknowledging the sacrifice without revealing details. Afterward, we shared a drink at the officers' club. You ever think about retiring? He asked. Sometimes. When the paperwork gets too heavy. You've got a few more years in you. Don't waste them. I won't. He raised his glass. To the ones who didn't make it back. I clinked my glass against his. To the ones who didn't make it back. In August, Maya Lopez made Major. She called me from wherever she was stationed, she couldn't say, which meant it was somewhere interesting, and I could hear the pride in her voice. I couldn't have done it without your mentorship, she said. Yes, you could have. You just would have gotten there a different way. Maybe. But I'm glad I had you. Me too. By September, I'd been in command for nearly 3 years. General Hart called me into his office and told me there was a new opportunity, a position at the Pentagon, working in strategic planning. It was a significant step up, a chance to influence policy at the highest levels. It's yours if you want it, he said. I thought about it for a week. The Pentagon meant politics, bureaucracy, meetings that stretched for hours and accomplished little. But it also meant impact. It meant shaping the future of the Air Force, ensuring that the lessons I'd learned, that people like Aaron and Maya had learned, weren't lost. I'll take it, I said. The transfer happened in November. I said goodbye to my team, handed command over to a sharp lieutenant colonel who'd been my deputy, and packed up my office. On my last day, the detachment threw a small ceremony. People said kind things, gave me a plaque, shook my hand. It felt surreal. That night, I called Frank. I'm moving to DC. New assignment. That's big. Yeah. You nervous? A little. You'll do fine. You always do. It was a small thing, but it meant something. I arrived in Washington in early December, just as the city was gearing up for the holidays. The Pentagon was everything I expected, massive, impersonal, full of people in uniforms moving with purpose. My office was on the 3rd floor, a small space with a desk, a computer, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. I unpacked my things slowly. The old unit patch from Frank went on a shelf, next to a photo of my team from Nellis and a coin Aaron had given me when I made lieutenant colonel. Small reminders of where I'd been and who'd helped me get here. The work was different. Less operational, more strategic. I spent my days in meetings, reviewing proposals, advising senior leadership on resource allocation and mission priorities. It wasn't the adrenaline-fueled intensity of tactical operations, but it mattered. Every decision I influenced, every policy I helped shape, had ripple effects across the entire Air Force. In January, Frank came to visit. He stayed with my mother's sister in Virginia and drove into the city to have lunch with me. We met at a diner near the Pentagon, the kind of place with vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like it had been sitting on the burner too long. This is your life now, he asked, looking around. Part of it. You miss the field? Sometimes. But this is where I can do the most good right now. He nodded. I'm proud of you, Charlie. I know I don't say it enough, but I am. I know. We finished our meal and walked outside. The air was cold, the sky gray. Frank pulled his jacket tighter and said, You turned out better than I ever imagined. Better than I deserved, honestly. You did your best. My best wasn't always good enough. No, I said. But it was enough to get us here. He smiled, small but genuine. I'll take that. The years in Washington passed in a blur of meetings, briefings, and policy reviews. I made colonel on the promotion list early and by my 3rd year at the Pentagon had become one of the senior advisors on special operations integration. It was demanding work, the kind that required constant attention and left little room for a personal life. But it was important work, and that mattered. I turned 45 in March. My mother sent flowers to my office, and Frank called to wish me happy birthday. We talked for 15 minutes about nothing in particular, his garden, my schedule, a documentary he'd watched about World War II. It was ordinary, comfortable, the kind of relationship I'd stopped believing we could have. In April, I received an invitation to speak at a commissioning ceremony at the Air Force Academy. The superintendent had specifically requested me, noting that my career trajectory and service record made me an ideal speaker for the incoming class of officers. I accepted, though the idea of standing in front of hundreds of people still made me nervous. I spoke at the Air Force Academy commissioning ceremony on a bright May morning. The cadets sat in neat rows, their faces full of excitement and apprehension, and I told them what I'd learned over decades of service. I told them the oath they'd take wasn't just words, it was a promise they'd be tested on their entire career. I talked about leadership and resilience, about loss and failure, about surrounding yourself with people who make you better. I referenced the hardest moments of my service without naming Unit 47 directly. I told them leadership wasn't about being perfect, it was about being present, honest, and willing to carry the weight of your decisions. Afterward, a young woman asked how I dealt with being one of the few women in my field. I told her I focused on the work, on what I could control, how I showed up, performed, and treated others. Eventually, the work spoke for itself. When she asked what to do if people still didn't take her seriously, I said to keep going anyway. Not for them, but for herself and for the people coming after who needed to see it was possible. Watching those cadets file out, I felt something close to peace. This was the legacy that mattered, the trail I'd left for others to follow. In June, I attended the first reunion for Unit 47 survivors. 4 of us gathered in a nondescript Virginia facility with high security. We didn't rehash missions or dwell on losses. We talked about what came after, how we'd rebuilt our lives, what we'd learned, where we were now. It was cathartic, a reminder that survival wasn't the end of the story, but the beginning of the next chapter. Collins, a former Army Ranger, asked what I'd been doing. I told him about my Pentagon work, the policies I'd shaped, the officers I'd mentored. He said I was making a difference. I told him he was too, just in different ways. In August, Frank collapsed. My mother called to say he'd been rushed to the hospital with another heart incident, more serious this time. I caught the next flight out. Frank was in the ICU when I arrived, hooked up to machines, looking smaller and frilier than I'd ever seen him. My mother sat beside him, exhausted and worried. Frank woke that night and apologized for not being better, for wasting years being stubborn instead of proud and supportive. I told him we couldn't get those years back, but we had now, and that was enough. He told me I was a hell of an officer and a hell of a person. We sat in the quiet ICU, and I felt something close to forgiveness, not for him, but for myself. For carrying the weight of his approval so long and finally learning to let it go. Frank recovered enough to go home, though the doctors warned another incident was likely. I returned to Washington and threw myself back into work, but I called more often. When I did, Frank was there, ready to talk. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. 3 years passed. Frank's health remained fragile but stable. I made Colonel early and was selected for a key role advising the Secretary of the Air Force on Special Operations Policy. By 48, after 26 years in uniform, people asked when I'd retire. The work still mattered, the missions still drove me, but I was tired in a way no sleep could fix, a deep, bone-level exhaustion. In September, I spoke at a military leadership conference on resilience and legacy. The day before, I flew to Texas to see Frank. He was in the VA hospital again, his condition stable but declining. We talked about small things, then about legacy. He said the thing he was most proud of was me, that I was his legacy. Everything I'd done, everyone I'd helped, that's what mattered. I told him I forgave him, but I couldn't go back to the way things were. That version of me didn't exist anymore. He understood. Frank passed away 2 weeks later, quietly and peacefully. I gave the eulogy at his small funeral, standing in front of people I'd known my whole life. I told them Frank was a soldier who served with honor, but also a man flawed, stubborn, capable of both great pride and great growth. He taught me what it meant to serve and showed me it's never too late to change, to learn, to become better than you were. I didn't sugarcoat our complicated relationship. Frank wouldn't have wanted that. On his desk, we found the photo of me in uniform that he'd kept on his mantle for years, me at 28, newly promoted to captain. I brought it back to Washington and put it on my desk. 2 years after Frank's funeral, I stood before another commissioning ceremony at Maxwell Air Force Base. I was 50 now, with nearly 3 decades of service behind me. I told those young officers they'd face situations with no clear answers, that they'd make mistakes and doubt themselves. I told them they were enough, not because they were perfect, but because they chose to serve. I mentioned Unit 47 publicly for the first time, carefully, without revealing classified details. A young woman approached afterward and said I was the reason she joined the Air Force. My words from years earlier had given her permission to be herself. I felt pride not in what I'd achieved, but in what I'd made possible for others. In June, I learned I was being considered for Brigadier General. At 50, I'd assumed my career would plateau at Colonel, but General Hart said the board had been unanimous. The promotion ceremony was held in October at the Pentagon. My mother, Rick Hayes, Aaron Beck, and Torres, the young SEAL Frank, had introduced me to all attended. When I looked out at the crowd, I saw faces representing every phase of my career. That evening, Aaron told me I'd earned this and would do incredible things with it. As a brigadier general, I used my platform to advocate for inclusive leadership practices, better support for special operations personnel, and stronger mentorship programs. In January, I attended the first official memorial service for Unit 47 at Arlington. I stood before the wall, tracing the 12 names engraved in stone, 12 people who'd given everything for missions that would never be fully acknowledged. It wasn't closure, but it was acknowledgement. And sometimes, that's the best you can hope for. Walking past the white headstones at Arlington, I thought about my journey from a small Texas town to the Pentagon, from second lieutenant to brigadier general, from a girl seeking her uncle's approval to a woman who no longer needed it. Respect isn't given. It's proven. And when it comes, you realize it was never about the respect at all. It was about the work, the mission, the people you served alongside. That's what endures. I'd done the work. I'd survived. And I'd left a trail for others to follow. That was legacy enough. That's my story. If it resonated, tap like, subscribe, and turn on alerts. New episodes every week. Drop a comment. Have you ever been dismissed by family and had to set a boundary? If you were me at that barbecue, what would you have said? Who finally recognized your work when others wouldn't, and how did it change you? Would you rebuild trust after a public insult or keep your distance? Share this with someone who needs proof that respect can be earned without permission.